impact session. So please again, join me in thanking our incredible speakers and panelists for their expertise, their honesty, and their vision of a vibrant Alexandria for everyone. So feel free to use the reaction buttons to share your appreciation. And we're going to practice and draws on 20 years of cross-sector experience, leading and implementing initiatives to increase economic opportunities for families with low income. She's also a senior fellow at the Social Policy Institute at Washington University in St. Louis. She served as executive director of the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty at the Urban Institute, director of the Office of Family Assistance at the Department of Health and Human Services under the Obama administration, and was the deputy director and part of the founding team of Ascend at the Aspen Institute, where she led national efforts to expand two-generation approaches to improve outcomes for children and their parents. That's an amazing resume. I also had the great pleasure of hearing Nisha moderate a panel at the Aspen Forum for Children and Families on Monday. And I walked away inspired and energized at what's possible for our community. So please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Nisha Patel.
Thank you, Brandy, for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my screen and then we can get started. Okay. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see that okay. Okay, just get it in the slideshow view. Okay, well, thank you again, Brandy, for that introduction, and to Heather and the whole team at ACT for inviting me. I'm honored always honored to be invited into communities, and I'm always especially excited to talk in my local community because I live right across the river in Washington, DC. And so I'm thrilled, and it sounds like you all have had a really wonderful conversation already this morning. And so I hope that I can add to that and really inspire some good dialogue as we go along. So as Brandy mentioned in her introduction, one of the many hats I've worn is I had the privilege of leading a 2-year commission called the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. And so much of what I'm going to talk about builds on that work and that effort. And I thought I would start out today actually talking about the focus of that commission, which was, where we started was this topic of the American dream, or some might say the fading American dream. Right, and so when you think about the American dream, and you ask most people, what is the American dream? What are we talking about here? Typically, I get one of two responses. People will say, well, the American dream is what you see on the left side of your screen. It's this idea that if you work hard, that you should have the chance to get ahead, right? Or even if you're in a situation where you're struggling, the dream is that your children will have a chance to do better. But if that's the dream, it really raises the question, what's the reality and how does that match up or not? And unfortunately, the reality is, and I think many of you know this from maybe your own experience and your own work, the dream is not right now within reach for everyone. And it turns out, in fact, that today children are less likely to do better than their parents. Across the board in the United States, we have lower rates of absolute economic mobility. And this idea that if you work hard, you can get ahead, unfortunately, that doesn't turn out to be true. Hard work isn't enough. We have fewer jobs today in the United States that pay good wages and good benefits, particularly for people who have less formal education. Now, what's interesting, just in the last few weeks, we're starting to see some upward pressure on wages as we hopefully are moving into economic recovery, and particularly in some industries that are facing worker shortages. So it'll be interesting to see if that trend turns around. And then I know a lot of this conference, we're talking about structural and systemic challenges. We know that race, place, and gender matter a lot when it comes to people's access to opportunity. It is not equal right now. And immigration status matters a lot as well. And then finally, something that's not visually on the slide that I want to talk about, and I'll go into each of these factors kind of as a backdrop for the conversation, is that when it comes to poverty in the United States, there is a lot of stigma. And we have ingrained inaccurate narratives about why people are in poverty or about people who are experiencing poverty. And that becomes a huge barrier to the progress that I think many of us would like to see. So let's kind of dig into each of these factors. So children are less likely to do better than their parents. So this is a really, it's just a line graph, but it's a really powerful visual. And this is an analysis from an economist, Rosh Chetty, who's one of the members of this commission, of this partnership. And for some of you, this graph may look familiar because it's gotten a lot of media attention in the last few years. And these are national data. It's a very large representative data set. And what you're looking at on the left side of your screen is for children born in the United States in 1940. For those children, 90% of those children, by the time they got to be adults, had a higher income than their parents. Okay, it was by the time they reached adulthood around age 30. So that's not everyone, but almost everyone. But then you fast forward 40 years to 1980, right? And so people who would be around age 40 today, that number drops. Only 50%, only half of children by the time they get to be adults earn more money than their parents. And a lot of economists would say, 50-50, that's a coin toss, right? And so that's essentially stagnant mobility. It's a huge drop. And this is a really significant structural issue in the United States. And I think, you think about conversations you have in your own family and in your community, you often hear people saying, it just feels like it's so much harder to get ahead today than it used to be. And that's just not a feeling, that's a fact. It actually is. It's much more of a struggle for many, many people. And it turns out, right, that this idea that if you just work hard is not enough. And there are a bunch of different data points that I could pull up to illustrate that point, a bunch of different facts that substantiate that. But I think this one is particularly powerful. And this is analysis from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, where they've looked all across the country at national data. And what they find is that in no state, no metropolitan area, no county, not in the city of Alexandria, can a full-time minimum wage worker afford to rent a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And they calculate that as 30% or less of your income. And this is despite the fact that in many states and in some local jurisdictions, the minimum wage is higher than the federal minimum, right? The federal minimum wage, which I believe it's also the minimum wage in Virginia, it's only $7.25 an hour. And it's kind of a shock to my system. Just across the river here in DC, our minimum wage is $15 an hour, but even that is not enough, right? If you're working 40 hours a week at that wage, it's still a struggle for people to be able to afford housing, to be able to afford childcare. So hard work, not enough. And then some of the structural inequities that we see, they persist across racial lines, gender lines, and across immigration status. And the data I want to share here are data that I calculated with colleagues at the Urban Institute. And this is looking at who's likely to be working in low wage jobs. And we used a wage of $12.50 an hour as the threshold. And what you see is that there are real differences by gender. Women are far more likely to be working for low wages than are men. And the easy way to look at this is if you just look at that first and second set of bars, you can clearly see many more women are working in low wage jobs. And then when we start to look at race and ethnicity, we can see that there are far greater shares of Black and Hispanic people working in low paying jobs than white people. And if you just look at each of the blue and green bars and you compare them to the yellow bars, you can see that a lot more people of color working in low wage jobs. And then when we start to look at the intersection, these disparities become even more amplified. When we look at race and ethnicity and gender together, what we see is that on the far left side of your screen, only 20% of white men are working in these low wage jobs versus almost 40% of Black women and 46% of Hispanic women. And then when we put another layer on that, which is your immigration status, the disparity becomes even greater. More than 60% of Hispanic women are who are non-citizens, including folks who might be legal permanent residents, it captures all different kinds of immigrants, are working in low wage jobs, right? So that compare that far left to the far right, big difference in who's working for low wages. And I'll just note this, this chart doesn't include data for Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans, but we would likely see differences in the data there as well. And these are all data that are prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we also know that in terms of how are we addressing, in our public policies, how are we addressing these structural issues? For the most part, our safety net failed to address these structural issues, and we have many children and families who continue to be trapped in poverty. And I'll just give you a few, these aren't data points that are on the screen, but just a few really powerful examples. You know, when we look at the Black unemployment rate compared to the white unemployment rate, even in a tight economy, in a, you know, what by traditional measures, a booming economy where overall unemployment is low, the Black unemployment rate is almost always twice the white unemployment rate. So it's really important when we look at the data to disaggregate it and really understand that when we look at an overall picture, it's not the same for every individual and every family. And why is this? You know, what is the reason for this? We have some real structural issues that are keeping people locked out of opportunity. We've got good research that documents racial discrimination by employers, both historic and present, continues to be a significant factor. We know we have a long history in the United States of federal, state, and local government policies and practices of housing discrimination and exclusionary zoning that have kept Black families and other families of color locked out of neighborhoods where good jobs are easily accessible. And we know that we have occupational segregation by race and gender. When we look at the numbers just from this past year, when we look at the end of December of last year, you know, hopefully things are starting to look better now, but at the end of this December, the United States economy lost 140,000 net jobs. And all of those jobs were held by women. When we look at the end of the year, women lost 156,000 jobs and men gained 16,000. And so I think that is really powerful to understand structural issues that are keeping people locked out of opportunity. And then let's talk about place. We'll look nationally and then we'll talk about Alexandria specifically. So starting with the national picture. This is again analysis from Rash Chetty, an economist, and his colleagues at his institute is called Opportunity Insights at Harvard. And what this map is showing you, I know it may be pretty small on your screen, so I'll give you the sort of highlights, but what this map is showing you is for children who are born into the bottom quintile, or the bottom 20% of income. So children who are born into the lowest income families across the United States, what are their chances of moving to the top 20% by the time they become adults? And again, this is a very large national sample of kids who were born in the late 70s and early 80s. The big takeaway from this map, when you look at the color scheme, is that where you see green, that indicates higher upward mobility, a better chance of moving out of poverty. And where you see red, that indicates less upward mobility. And so, for example, when you look at, draw your eye toward California and parts of the West and the Midwest, you see a lot of green, you see a lot of patches of dark green, which means that, you know, if you don't have a choice as a child, but if you're a child who was born into a low income household, you have a much better shot if you were in one of those zip codes that's in green, right? And you look at San Jose. Historically, this is the Silicon Valley area. For kids that were born, part of the generation born in the late 70s and early 80s, if you were going to be born into a household without much money, that was probably the best possible place in the country to be born because your shot of moving up was the greatest. But there's a real question now that I think is really instructive for the rest of the country, and particularly for our metro region in the DC Alexandria area, which is they have a serious, probably the most serious affordable housing crisis in the country. And that raises a question of whether that any longer today in 2021, whether a kid born in that community has the same shot of moving up. And I think we're likely to be facing similar challenges in our region. But I would contrast that if you look sort of toward the lower right side of the screen with the deep south, the southeastern United States, where you see just a swath of dark red. And perhaps not surprisingly, given what we know about historic and present structural racism in the United States, those areas where you see dark red are also the areas of the country where we have the highest concentration of Black people living. And other dark patches of dark red also overlap with areas where we have the highest concentration of Native Americans living. And I don't think this is surprising. In fact, this is very much by design in terms of public policies that were put in place. And so the big takeaway from this visual is that right now, your zip code can help shape your destiny, right? Something that you have no choice in, the zip code that you're born into and where you're born. plays a major role. And if you look at the area surrounding Washington, D.C., I know it's really small, but including Alexandria, you can see that it looks fairly green as a whole. But what I want to do now is kind of zoom in on the next slide. And I've pulled up here. And so this is my crude outline of Alexandria. I hope that I've gotten it accurate. But there's an online data tool that allows you to drill down by census tract and zip code. And so that's what I've done here for the city of Alexandria. I think it's really important. I know in the last conversation, you all were talking about the importance of understanding our history, right? Our history in the United States, but our history in the city of Alexandria. And so let's do that here with this same data set. What we're looking at here is for that same cohort of kids who were born into low-income families in the late 70s and early 80s. So this would be people in this Zoom room, anybody in the room who's around age 40. If you were born in Alexandria and you grew up here, that's who we're talking about. You can see that when you look at low-income children across Alexandria, it looks pretty good overall. You see lots of the color scheme's a little different. It's more blue than green here. But where you see blue, what that means if you were born into a low-income family, you had a good shot of upward mobility. And it looks pretty different. If you just look across the river at DC, you see a lot of dark red. So perhaps for a lot of kids who, were fortunate to be born during that time period in Alexandria, they had a good fighting chance of moving up economically. But it would be really interesting to hear from folks in the chat and people who are longtime Alexandria residents or new residents, what's going on today. These are historic data. Are you seeing, do these patterns still hold true for children who are born in Alexandria today, or is it different? And for example, I would, looking at this map, many of you will know more intimately these neighborhoods than I do if you've lived in the area for a long time. The red area to the north, it's really small print, you probably can't read it, but it's labeled on this map as Lynn Haven. And I believe that sort of overlaps with what I think we think about as Arlandria today. We know we have higher concentrations of people experiencing poverty in that area, whereas some of the red areas to the south, which kind of overlaps with Old Town, the demographics might be very different there today than they were 40 years ago. And similarly, if you look sort of at the western side of the map, kind of going out toward Landmark Mall, this was a higher opportunity area for children who were born into low-income households 40 years ago. And that might be a very different situation today because we know the demographics have changed. The national economy has changed and the local economy has changed. And so I think that might be an interesting, discussion for folks. I know you've got some time on the agenda later in the conference to kind of dig into. It's one thing to look at the data, but there are always these lags in the data. How do the data reflect the current community experience, and how is the current experience different? Okay, fifth and final factor that I want to dig into is this idea that particularly in the United States, the narratives that we have about poverty are extremely isolating and extremely stigmatizing for people and for families who are experiencing poverty. And this is just one study, but I think what it illustrates is this idea that Americans as a whole, we tend to other people living in poverty. I'm using that as a verb. We tend to other people, meaning that we reinforce our own bonds with people who are in some way like us, and then we devalue others by assigning them outsider status. So if you're inside my circle, right, I perhaps have more of an appreciation of structural issues, right? You might say, oh, well, that person, they don't have enough money because I know that they lost their job or they had a health issue. So I can understand that. But for someone that we don't know, sometimes that comes with a set of assumptions about why might they be in the situation they're in. And what this chart is showing is a study of college students using a 5-point scale. And what the researchers found were really large differences in beliefs about people in poverty versus people who are middle class across a wide range of attributes. And I've just pulled out a few of them here. But what was really it's startling is that people in poverty, which are the yellow bars on your screen, were far more likely to be viewed as being dirty, unpleasant, and violent, and far less likely to be seen as being responsible, family-oriented, and hardworking. Right, so that's pretty heartbreaking. And all of what I've just shared is kind of the backdrop against which the US Partnership on Mobility and Poverty went about our work. And our work was over the course of 2 years to really dig into this homework assignment. What would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty? Or to put another way, what would it take to turn things around and actually, either restore the American dream, or if it's, clearly it is not, for many people, it's not been possible, to actually make it possible for most people in the United States. And we had a particular emphasis on philanthropy and government, the public sector, as the audience for these recommendations, because we recognize where are the resources going to come from, right, to turn this around. At the same time, we recognized for any of these ideas to be implemented, it's the folks that are in this Zoom room, right? It is community-based nonprofit organizations, advocates, faith-based organizations, and employers. Everyone in this room can play a key role in testing and implementing and moving some of these ideas forward. So, just quick background and acknowledgement. My slide is not changing. There we go. Hopefully that moved. You should be seeing kind of a yellow hued slide on your screen. Somebody give me a thumbs down if you don't, but it's, so just a bit, everything that I'm going to share now is collective work. So I'm sharing it, but it is the work of lots and lots of people that went into these recommendations. And this partnership was comprised of 24 members, and 24 members that I want to highlight came from incredibly diverse backgrounds and perspectives. This group was majority people of color, and we had people from different sectors, different political points of view, economists, psychologists, sociologists, people from the faith community, people from the business community, people running direct service programs on the ground. We had 5 MacArthur geniuses. And so it was quite, I always say, like, I've had a lot of jobs where my job is herding cats. This was herding lions, right? And something else that's really important is that unlike some other commissions, we weren't a consensus group. So we didn't just have to come up with kind of one idea. We actually came up with a range of different recommendations, and not everybody had to agree on one best idea. And so I think that led to a much more generative set of recommendations. In addition to like what we found, I wanted to share a bit about how we went about our work, because I think it was pretty different from some processes that have come before. And so we started out really big, dreaming big, and looking at big themes and forces that shape social and economic mobility in the United States. And so we looked at this idea of place that I've talked about. We also looked at new and emerging research about behavioral psychology, new economic data, new brain science that wasn't available 20 years ago. And so what you're seeing on your screen are some of the graphic recordings that were created real time during our deliberations. And we looked very intentionally at race, at gender, at inclusion, at dignity. And we looked at the changing labor market, which is it's changing even more with the disruptions of the last year. And importantly, we looked at the intersections of all these themes, which doesn't often happen. And that was part of the power of having people from different backgrounds and disciplines at the table. And to ground our exploration, our research team at the Urban Institute developed a working paper that outlined 13 different building blocks of mobility and examples of promising programs. And I'm going to give you a website at the end, which is mobilitypartnership.org, that will allow you to dig deeper on anything that might spark your interest in this conversation. But as you can see, we looked at a very wide range of issues, because there's not just one factor when it comes to economic mobility, and there's not just one solution. And so we looked at housing, early learning, safety and justice, across employment and training, health and mental health, and everything in between. But in addition to looking at all that traditional evidence and research, one of the things that I brought, and I actually said this was a condition of me taking this role. I was very happily working for the Obama administration, and it was hard to get me to leave, but I said, I'll do it, but there has to be one condition. Actually, a couple of conditions. I was like, race has to be on the table, because we, often in this country avoid talking about it, yet we know structural racism undergirds a lot of the reasons people are locked out of opportunity. But number 2, community voices have to be at the table. So often in these conversations, it is, traditional research and evidence, and that's really important to consider, people that, are economists, sociologists who are doing this work, quote, policy experts. But so often we don't actually talk to the people whose lives are impacted by the policies. And so my condition was that has to be part of this process. Those voices, we have to have creative freedom to bring those voices to the table? And the answer was yes. So I said, okay, I will take this on. And so spending time in communities became a very important part of our work, and breaking bread with community residents, understanding their perspectives. And so all told, we spent time in 30 plus different diverse urban, suburban, rural, and tribal communities across the country, and grounded the deliberations of this commission in what we heard from communities, in addition to looking at data and research. And in particular, perspectives of people currently experiencing poverty. We certainly had people who were part of this commission who had experienced poverty in their lifetime. But poverty in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s is a very different context than in 2016 when we began this work. And it's always been fascinating to me. I'm someone who's trained as a social worker. When I think, I've sat in a lot of privileged positions in my professional roles. And when you think about anybody who's in the room who might work for a private sector company, there's no private sector company that would develop a product and just kind of like release it and roll it out without first testing it with the consumers for whom it was intended, right? Like that just doesn't make any kind of business sense. Yet in philanthropy and in government and public policy, we do this all the time. We talk to a bunch of people who are the quote experts, right? The researchers, we look at the data and we're like, okay, great. We think we know the answer, and then we roll out a program. And then we wonder why people don't show up, or why it doesn't work, or why we're not getting the traction that we would want. And it's like, well, did we ask the people for whom it was intended? Is this what they even want or need? So it's a real oversight, and something like throughout the course of my career, I've been trying to really push against and try to correct for. And so it's exactly what we did in this work. And recall that map. There were certain places on the map that seemed really important to spend some time in and learn from by talking to people living in those communities. And so we spent time in the rural Mississippi Delta, those dark red, deepest red swaths, right? Ground zero for economic mobility in the country. And it had a really powerful impact. And I wanted to highlight this because there are just things that you can learn. And perhaps you all know this from your own work, by talking to people in a community versus looking at a visual or reading a research paper, right? There are perspectives that just don't get captured. And I think it was a particularly powerful experience for people who in academia, who don't often get outside of that academic ivory tower setting and spend time, and particularly spend time in parts of the country like the Deep South. But then we said, okay, we learned a ton from that experience. I mean, driving through those cotton fields for some people, it was like going back in time and understanding some of the public policies that continue to be in place in a place like Mississippi. Then we said, okay, well, if that's the place where it's toughest for kids who were born into poverty, what about the place where it seemed to be best? What about Silicon Valley? So it historically has one of the highest rates of economic mobility. And so we said, we've got to spend some time there. And each of these gatherings, we started with this immersive experience in community. The photograph that you see on your screen is a community center in the Mayfair neighborhood in East San Jose. And this is the neighborhood. I don't know if anybody in the room is from that part of the country. This is the neighborhood where Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez began their organizing work. And this is a community, it's primarily, predominantly a Mexican immigrant community, but increasingly Filipino and Vietnamese immigrant community. And so we were having this conversation in simultaneous Spanish-English interpretation. And I highlight that because not only is it important for community residents to be able to speak with their own voice, it's also important to be able to speak in your own language. And community residents in this conversation over lunch were sharing with us that renting a couch in their community can cost $600 a month, not a room, but a couch, right? $600 a month. And this was a couple of years ago, so it might be even more now. Renting a garage for a family to live in can cost $1,000 a month. Not a house, but a garage, right? So babies are being born and coming home to live in garages. And I often like to highlight that in our region, in the DC region in particular, because I get really worried every time I'm out on the West Coast that I'm looking into like a apocalyptic crystal ball. And I don't want our region to end up in that situation. And I think there's a real danger. So that's an extreme situation, but you can see when we drill down to the local level, we have some type of disparities in almost every part of the country, including in our region. So after all of this time spent looking at research, all of this time spent in communities, what were the big insights coming out of this work that might be of use to you in Alexandria? In my view, it is the definition of mobility that we put forward. So our assignment was to think big, right? Think creatively and answer the question, what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty? And we're certainly not the first group to ever tackle these kinds of issues, but one of the things that was distinct about our work is we said, we don't want to limit ourselves to a traditional narrow definition of poverty. Because if we were to do that, the federal definition of the federal poverty level for a family of 4 is $26,500. It became pretty clear when we started talking about, well, what would success look like? How would we know that the recommendations we're putting forward are successful? It would have been easy to kind of, in some ways take the easy way out. We had a bunch of really smart economists. We could have come up with some policies and modeled them and said, well, what does it take to get a family of 4 above $26,500? Let's get them to $26,501, right? We can kind of pat ourselves on the back, but that would be, I think, false success, because when you step back and you think about it, think about in Alexandria, if a family is earning just over $26,500, are they out of poverty? Are they on a pathway to mobility? Can a family of 4 live, survive, thrive on $26,501 in Alexandria or anywhere in the country? I think pretty quickly, when you start breaking that down, the answer is no. People would continue to struggle. And so there has to be more to this than simply economic success. Super important, but not enough. And so at our very first gathering, one of our partnership members, John Powell, who does a lot of work around this concept of othering and belonging, he's based at UC Berkeley, we're having this conversation. He said something that was incredibly powerful that just really stopped the conversation in a good way, and it made us pause. He said, poverty is not just about a lack of money. It's also about a lack of power. And that was it really shook up our thinking. So it's not to say that the economic piece isn't important. It's foundational. People have to have enough money. Income and assets are super important. In fact, they're fundamental and foundational. But there's another piece, which is this notion of power and autonomy, having agency over your life, having a say in what happens in the trajectory of your own life, but also having a say in what happens in your community, having a voice in your community. But that's also not enough. So there's also a third piece, and we frame this as being valued in community. Some might call this belonging. In fact, John Powell, who comes from sort of a left progressive political perspective, talks about it as belonging. But what was really interesting, I mentioned that we had people from very different political points of view. And so Arthur Brooks, who comes from a conservative perspective, and at the time was heading up the American Enterprise Institute, kind of found this resonating with him as well. And he talked a lot about the notion of dignity. And it became pretty clear that we had these people from very different political points of view talking about the same concept and labeling it differently. And I think as importantly, maybe more importantly, what we found is that this concept was resonating again and again in community after community, whether it was suburban, urban, rural, or in Indian country. And so whenever I start to see something resonating with very, very different groups of people, it makes me think, okay, we're onto something here. And in fact, what's kind of wound up in this green circle is often what sociologists refer to as social capital. And so we put forward these principles, not just because a bunch of traditional experts thought they were right, but because they were validated in community after community. And I have found over the last 3 years, they continue to resonate no matter where I am. Mostly virtually these days, but when I'm able to be there in person in the United States, they resonate with lots of different people from all walks of life. And so we said, okay, if this is really what mobility is, it's all 3 of these things, then we should be measuring success across all 3 of these constructs. And typically what we focus on right now is, whether it's a government agency or a foundation or a nonprofit, we're typically looking at this blue circle when we do our performance outcomes and our metrics, right? And just to give you an example, let's take one that I think will be familiar to many of you, a job training program, right? We want to help people have access to better jobs. And so we'll create a job training program that will help people build skills and be able to get better jobs and earn more money. And typically when we measure success, we measure things like, well, did a person actually get a job? They finished the training, but were they able to get a job, right? Number one. And then second, we might say, well, how much did their wages increase? Were they earning more money when they got that job? And then the third thing we often say, well, were they able to retain that job, right? 90 days later, were they still in that job? And all that's important. All of that is good. And that's tied to the blue circle. But what would it mean if we started looking at the yellow circle and the green circle? So if we were also starting to measure power and autonomy, we might look at, well, how much flexibility does that job provide? Does the person have any amount of autonomy or power in that job? Does it provide a flexible schedule? Or does it at least provide a consistent, predictable schedule that's going to allow that person to balance their work and family responsibilities, right? That would be a way to start to get at power and autonomy. And then on the green circle, if we were look at like, well, does a job allow a person to be valued in community? We might start to measure things like social capital and social networks. So it's great that this person now has a job and hopefully they're earning a bit more money, but is that job allowing them to make connections to help them find another job? What if that business closes? What if they get laid off? What happens then? Are they able to build a network that helps them get to another job? Or, if there isn't an opportunity for them to move up in that company or that organization, are they able to build a network so they can find that next best job? Right? And so if these were our measures of success that were tied to government funding streams and philanthropic grants, it might fundamentally change the way we design our programs, right? It might fundamentally change the way that we design our public policies. So I spent a lot of time on that, but I think to me that it's really a paradigm shift in how we think about what success could look like. And so that's kind of the definitions or the principles behind mobility, but what are the strategies? Like, how are we going to get there? How are we going to increase social and economic mobility? And so we generated a bunch of different recommendations, and then we sort of, kind of the opposite of a lot of processes. We didn't say, well, here's the framework and let's plug it in. We said, let's just generate the best recommendations we can come up with, and then let's figure out how they all tie together. And one of the ways this group felt that all of this work ties together, particularly if we want to address structural and systemic issues, is that we need to change narratives. We need to shift narratives around how we talk and think about poverty in the United States and people experiencing poverty in the United States. And I know you've got an entire session later in this conference talking about narratives. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see how this might connect to that conversation tomorrow. But very briefly, narratives, when we talk about narratives are the stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. They are overarching, they're the context for everything, right? And as we discussed earlier, poverty in the United States is highly stigmatizing, largely because of inaccurate narratives that we have about poverty. I often say that, like, when you ask a fish, how's the water? The response is, what's water? That's what narratives are. They're so entrenched, they're so ingrained, we don't even realize that they're there. And what we have to do, I don't have the answer of like this fill in the blank, here's the new narrative, but we certainly need a narrative that recognizes as a nation, historically, we have not been all in it together, right? We might like to believe that, but it isn't true. Things have not been equal for a very long time. And I think we need to get to a place where we recognize, and perhaps for some folks, we have, this has shifted thinking during the pandemic. What impacts one of us actually impacts all of us, right? And if we have that kind of philosophy, that changes the strategies that we might think about. And the belief coming out of our work was that if we can shift narratives, what that will do is open up opportunities to move policy and program ideas at greater scale. But there's no way fundamentally that you can change systems without changing narratives and mindsets. So this is really key. And why is that important? It's important because what we believe about poverty ultimately shapes our investments, it shapes our public policy decisions. And so, for example, if you believe that people are poor, people are experiencing poverty because they don't work hard enough, right? That leads you down one set of strategies or responses to the challenge. But if you recognize the structural issues that I outlined earlier, if you recognize that actually a lot of people are working very hard, but despite that, housing is unaffordable. Childcare is unaffordable, and it's not just affecting one person, it's affecting lots and lots of people, particularly in our region. That leads you to an entirely different set of strategies. And one of the big strategies might be creating access to good jobs, right? So our aspiration here is that everyone ought to have a chance to get a good job. And what do we mean by a good job, right? So I've just talked about mobility. Yes, we want the job to pay good wages, but there are a bunch of other things that make a job a good job. And access to those kinds of jobs has changed dramatically over the last few decades because of big changes and big shifts in the labor market, nationally and locally. So we have seen a decline in traditional employment relationships that provide good wages, benefits, workplace protections, right? We have a lot more people who are working in, depending on the tax form you file, 1099 jobs versus W-2 jobs. And so if you're a contract worker, you don't get access to a retirement plan and to health insurance that your employer subsidizes, right? And to a bunch of workplace protections. They're just not available to you. Huge decline in unionization in the public sector, and traditionally unions have been a way to kind of balance power in the workplace and create space for worker voice. And for any one of us, there's a massively decreased likelihood that we'll work for one long-term employer, right, with a pension plan or a retirement plan that's going to provide security later in life. Not the case for most people anymore. And then we've seen some things that have increased dramatically. So huge increase in alternative work arrangements. I mentioned before 1099 workers. Many more of us are working in contract jobs, in temp jobs, in on-call jobs. And then an increase in the number of people who are working simultaneously for multiple employers because they're not able to earn enough at one job, right? Lots of people, working in gig economy jobs, side hustles that might actually be their main hustle. That's the way they're able to earn income. And then what we have seen is what some economists talk about of this fissuring of the workforce across employers by wages and education. And what they mean by that is when you look at big firms that have highly educated, highly skilled workers like tech companies, we've seen most of the gains. I mean, look at who the highest earning people, or the people with the highest income, the billionaires are in this country, right? Huge returns going to people with the most wealth and the highest skills. And meanwhile, people that, you remember that chart where I was showing you who's in those low wage jobs making less than $12.50 an hour, those wages have, up until now, have stagnated. Again, there might be some bright spots right now. We'll see if that is, just a blip or if that becomes a long-term trend in terms of upward pressure on those wages. And then there are just some other things that are shifting all together in our economy. So rapid shifts in the way people get access to jobs. And so many more online recruitment and job search tools, displacement of jobs by automation and artificial intelligence. And you think about, bank tellers, some of whom were replaced by ATMs, and ATMs now being replaced by electronic and digital payments. Cashiers in many retail stores being replaced by self-checkouts, right? In the future, truck drivers being replaced by self-driving vehicles, probably not in the not too distant future. So, where does that lead us in terms of recommendations? So most of the economists in our group felt like there'll be no shortage of jobs, but there may just not be enough good, well-paying jobs that offer career pathways, right? That offer autonomy, that offer social capital building opportunities. But I love this quote. One of our partnership members, Larry Katz, who's an economist, said, robots don't yet do empathy. And he said that because there are a number of jobs like care work, which is one of the fastest growing sectors in our economy, are unlikely to be replaced by robots anytime soon. So anybody in this room, if you have a job where empathy is a requirement of that job, don't worry, robots not going to come get your job anytime soon. But there are a lot of other things that we do need to work on. So some of the ideas that we put forward were perhaps a new approach to worker classification. Instead of just having 1099 workers and W-2 workers, maybe we need to rethink that. And we need policies that offer protections to more workers. Maybe we need benefits that are portable and not just tied to one employer, right? So if you leave a job, you don't lose your health insurance, you don't lose your retirement plan, for example. Building more capacity for worker voice. Thinking about, and particularly, as we have these fluctuations in the economy, the idea of job guarantees and subsidized jobs so that everybody that wants to work actually has access to work and to a job. And then better connecting job training to jobs that are in demand, specifically at community colleges. And so this was back in 2018, right? Not that long ago that we released these recommendations. And we actually talked about, in particular, care workers and food service workers as being essential, but undervalued, their labor being undervalued. And it's been interesting that 2 years later, with the pandemic, it really opened a lot more people's eyes to the value that these workers provide to our society, but the compensation they receive you know, the autonomy they receive, the social capital they have access to in their jobs doesn't mirror their contributions to society. And so I would highlight that. I hope that's a long-term narrative shift, that we start to recognize the value of people that are providing that labor to our society. Okay, then the third piece, we talked a lot earlier about place and about zip code, right? We saw that where you're born and where you grow up plays a significant role in your chances of upward mobility. So we had a whole bunch of recommendations around this, and I'll tick through them really quickly. And again, I'm going to give you a website at the end. So if something resonates with you, there's actually a long paper on each, and there's also a 2-page snapshot of each recommendation, because I know folks are busy, and so you can dig in a little bit or dig in a lot. But our big recommendations around this, one was the idea of creating opportunity neighborhoods everywhere, right? That every neighborhood should be a neighborhood where children have a chance to thrive. And so to do that, it's long-term work. We have to transform communities and the institutions that serve them. We have to remove some of those policy barriers that have limited where people can live and learn. And we need to encourage more economically diverse neighborhoods versus having wealth concentrated in one place and poverty concentrated in another place. And one of the ways to do that is around housing vouchers. We know the importance, particularly for young children, of safe, stable, and caring environments. And so we had a very specific policy recommendation that was vastly increasing the number of rental vouchers, particularly for families with children under 6. So for those families that want the choice, only for those that want the choice, right? It has to be an opt-in kind of thing. They might be able to move to a neighborhood that had offered better housing, better schools, better access to jobs and transportation. So I'm happy to say the Biden administration is actually moving forward on this, and they're about to release $5 billion in new housing vouchers. And so, and I'm not sure, but for the pandemic, housing would have gotten the attention that it's gotten. So that's been really interesting. Improving access to financial services. One of our recommendations around that was hugely increasing the amount of resources that go to community development financial institutions, or CDFIs. And we're starting to see some movement from this in the Biden administration as well. And then finally, we spent a fair amount of time on the issue of safety and justice. And we developed a proposal that we framed as participatory justice, and sort of raised the question, like perhaps violence and perhaps like the criminal justice law enforcement footprint might be reduced if residents of communities where there is concentrated poverty and high crime had the power and the autonomy to work together with other key stakeholders to identify what they want and need from a justice system, right? What does justice look like? What does safety look like? And really redefining that. And just to make that a little bit more concrete, like what if residents had a say in how resources were allocated? What if the dollars that are right now spent on mass incarceration, on yanking primarily young men of color out of communities, it's either through incarceration or through police violence, what if those dollars were spent in more upstream ways on things like positive youth development? I think it's not for me to say what the solution is. That really needs to come from community residents. But I think it was interesting for me to think about those recommendations we put forward in 2018 and to sort of like think about those alongside and some of the defund the police conversations that were catalyzed in 2020. So I think that's a really important area for many communities to look at. Okay, the fourth piece here around providing support that empowers. I think there are a bunch of different recommendations we came up with here, but essentially what we were highlighting here is that we have many policies and programs nationally and locally that on their surface or in their goal they're framed as helping people on pathways out of poverty, but the way those services are provided aren't necessarily in a way that offers dignity, that offers respect, that fosters engagement with the community. And so our aspiration here was that programs and policies should put families at the center, support their goals and capacities, and work across different domains. And this goes back to the idea of engaging people who are actually experiencing poverty in the design of the solutions, right? Who are you building the program for? Well, perhaps the people who it's being built for ought to be in the driver's seat when the program is being designed. So we developed a large number of proposals around this, but I particularly want to highlight a couple that are, I would say, are a hot topic because they're moving in the current moment. And I think there are some specific opportunities in Alexandria to help move these policies forward. And what I would say, when you think about support that empowers, To me, the ultimate support that empowers in a capitalist society is cash. If you do not have access to cash, if you do not have access to money, it becomes very difficult to obtain economic stability, let alone mobility. And so what are the mechanisms we have of getting cash directly into people's pockets? Well, I've been doing this work for 25 years, and what I want to really lift up, it sounds wonky on its surface, but to me, it is one of the most groundbreaking federal public policy developments I've seen in 25 years, which is the expanded child tax credit. So we had a very specific recommendation coming out of our work to expand the child tax credit, and particularly for families with children under 6, because of very well-established research that shows how much a difference of $3,000 in income makes to children while they're young in terms of their later workforce outcomes and economic mobility. So the American Rescue Plan actually does this. It expands the refundable child tax credit, and it expands it for up to $3,000 annually for children ages 6 to 17, and for children under 6, it's $3,600 annually. And just to make this really, really concrete, this benefit is available to 88% of children in the United States, and there is no minimum income threshold. So it is available even to children whose parents may not be working right now. And it's really, really, and let me make this even more concrete. What that would mean, let's take a family that has a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. What that means is an additional $300 a month for the child under 6 and $250 a month for the child who's over the age of 6. So that's $550 a month. And for families that have filed their income taxes and they receive tax refunds by direct deposit, on July 15th, they're going to start receiving that cash directly into their bank accounts. So that's wonderful for those families that have filed their taxes. But for families that earn too little and didn't file taxes previously, which is disproportionately Black and Latinx families. So this is a policy that actually addresses structural racism in previous public policy. Huge numbers of Black and Latinx families were left out of the previous tax policy because these kids' parents earn too little to qualify. So that's a huge reform. So this is wonderful, but this is where every single person in this room comes in. There are a whole bunch of families that have never filed taxes before. So the IRS has no track record of them. And without them getting connected to the IRS, they're not going to get these cash payments. And so what needs to happen is it's sort of threefold. Number one, this year's tax season is over. So for families that have not filed taxes in 2021, the IRS in mid-July is going to be setting up a portal. And so families need to register in this portal so that they can get access to these cash payments, similar to what happened with the economic income payments. But we know they're huge, that we continue to have digital divides. And so it's gonna take work by community-based organizations, faith-based organizations to, employers to help get families connected. That's phase one. For families that don't get connected this year, all is not lost, but we've gotta get those families support to file income tax returns in early 2022 for their 2021 taxes. Because if they do that, they're still eligible for the lump sum payment. That's phase two. So get families connected to the portal in 2021, 2022, help more families to file their taxes. Phase three is this wonderful policy is only approved for 1 year. It's not permanent. And so for this policy to become permanent, it is going to take advocacy in every congressional district around the country. And I would argue, I don't care if your district is red, blue, or purple, every single person should be in support of this policy, because what this policy does is put cash in the pockets of families who wouldn't otherwise have it, and they will spend those dollars in the local economy. So I think there's a good business case to be made to support this policy. So this is a policy that benefits children. Taking it a step further, we could think about public policy that would benefit everyone, regardless of whether they have children. And that would be something like a guaranteed income or a basic income. And I know that's something that the city of Alexandria is at least considering in terms of developing a pilot. And so if that's something you'd like to see more on, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to your city council members about that. The last quick thing I'll say, so that's cash. The other piece I want to highlight is what does the service delivery model look like in human services? And one of the big recommendations we put forward was around this idea of testing coach navigator models. And these were models that could potentially revolutionize human services. Rather than a top-down case management model, it's rethinking services to be much more of an empowering coaching model with participants who can set their own goals, work toward them, and work across different domains, whether that's housing, physical and mental well-being, financial management, education and training, and employment. So it's a much more holistic approach that cuts across silos, and it could potentially also creatively be paired with things like guaranteed income, or people working in these coaching roles could be the people that help connect families to things like the child tax credit and other benefits. Okay, I've said a lot. I am going to wrap up by giving you the final piece of this puzzle, which is in green, which is if narrative is overarching and it kind of shapes everything we do, data undergird everything we do, right? We have billions of public and private resources that are deployed to address poverty annually, but the results of those efforts are not always clear. And I can guarantee you that every person working in a nonprofit or a government agency in this room, you collect vast amounts of data, right? That potentially could be used to help people on pathways to opportunity, to hold programs accountable. But rarely are those data linked, right? You've got agency over A collecting this data and agency B collecting this data, but not necessarily talking to each other. And so the data are rarely shared in ways that are accessible and usable, particularly to families themselves. And so our aspiration here was that we really need to transform data systems to increase accountability and transparency, not accountability on families, which is usually the way the policy is framed, but accountability to families. How are their data being used, and how can they be used to help families move to greater social and economic mobility? And I think I want to make this concrete because I know that sometimes you talk about data and people's eyes glaze over. And I want to do this by actually sharing a quote that from one of our site visits, which was actually in Baltimore. And this was with the person who was the Commissioner of Health in Baltimore at the time, who said, as part of child fatality review, department heads in Baltimore city government get together once a month. We review every child death that happened in the city since the previous meeting. We ask what more might have been done to prevent that tragedy. In many cases, each of us has a file on the child or family at least an inch thick. It's tragic to compare notes after the child has died. What more could have been done when the child was alive? And I think that really, really powerfully illustrates the need for data systems to be interconnected. And so some of the ideas that we proposed here were investing in promising solutions at the state and local level, and supporting data centers that can match data across systems, but also protect people's privacy, which is important, and then creating some standards for data infrastructure. And so what I will say in conclusion and in summary is that this idea of like dramatically increasing mobility from poverty, there's not one solution. It is going to require investment across these 5 mutually reinforcing strategies, and it's going to require cross-sector collaboration, every single person in this room. There's not one government agency, one philanthropy or foundation, one nonprofit organization, one faith-based organization that can do it alone. But our belief coming out of this process of 2+ years of work was that by working together, we can dramatically increase mobility from poverty and begin to restore this idea of the American dream of making it a reality. And I believe that's true nationally, and I believe it's true right in the city of Alexandria. So I will stop there. I will give you the website if you want to dig into more details, and I will pass the mic back to Brandy and just do a check to see if we have time to take any of the questions from the chat. I haven't had a chance to look at it while I'm talking, but I'm going to pull it up now.
Yes, Nisha, wow, you're going to find that there are a lot of amens to everything that you're saying. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. There are so many things for us to think about. I think engaging community members in decision-making, changing the narrative really resonated with people, and they really love the opportunity maps too. And I think, as Heather pointed out, this is really timely, this discussion, as the city of Alexandria has several proposals for the use of the American Rescue Plan funds. Things that talk about guaranteed income, service navigation, upskilling to access better jobs, support for childcare, and it's all being shared at the city council meeting tonight. So some of the questions that came up were really around guaranteed income. So can you just touch a little bit more about that and kind of what you've seen in communities across the country?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like the context for the conversation around guaranteed income has shifted majorly just in the last year. So when we were having our deliberations, there were a lot of people who felt like, oh, guaranteed income, nice idea, but like, oh, politically, that'll never happen. The two critiques were politically, there won't be enough political will. And second, it's just not financially feasible. Well, along comes a pandemic and really shifts the context and the conversation, and we have a Congress that decides like, oh, we actually can borrow, we actually can go into debt to make sure that people in the United States, more people in the United States don't fall into poverty. So the political will around that, just in terms of the federal policies, changed, and the financial feasibility. And then what I'm seeing around the country is every week I learn about a new guaranteed income pilot. I mean, there are probably over 100 guaranteed income pilots in the country right now, including across the river from you in DC. I have heard that other jurisdictions, even in our region, are thinking about developing them. Two of the leading edge ones, Brandy talked about a session that I moderated with the Aspen Institute earlier this week. The Magnolia Mothers Trust in Jackson, Mississippi is now the longest running, and it's only 3 years old. And that is very specifically focused on Black mothers and their children living in public housing. And the SEED demonstration in Stockton, California just released their first year results. And what's really promising about both of those pilots is that they're finding not only is it making a difference for families economically, it is starting to get at some of those other aspects of mobility that I talked about. This notion of power and autonomy and agency and belonging, they're starting to see results that point in that direction. And very specifically, they're starting to see results in terms of people's mental health, reduced anxiety, reduced depression. I mean, one of the sort of quotes from a person who's like, this is better than Prozac when it comes to addressing mental health issues. So it's like, it's sort of, when you think about it, it shouldn't be surprising, but if you can reduce people's financial stress, certainly that's not the only stressor that any of us have in our lives, but it can go a long way in addressing other aspects that are keeping families in challenging situations. And we know that there is a strong link between maternal depression and child anxiety. And so there are reasons, the monetary piece, as I said before, is foundational, but there are many other pieces to think about. And there is a thread here. I do want to pull a thread from these guaranteed income pilots to the child tax credit that I talked about, because they're different mechanisms, but the impact is the same. There are different ways of delivering cash directly to families. And with child tax credit, I mentioned that's 88% of children. I want to make sure people heard that. And a partial credit is available to families earning up to $400,000. So this is a benefit that is available to people with no income, people with middle income, and even, some upper income families. And so I think I hope that it has the type of political will that can help make the policy permanent. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so we can see each other better.
Great, thank you. I was just gonna ask you that.
Sorry about that, I just realized.
No problem at all. Thank you. Okay, so another question. So it's easy for the impact of race to kind of slide out of these discussions around the strategies that you talked about, which are race neutral on their face. How do we work to incorporate race into our discussion of these sorts of strategies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a astute observation, whoever asked that question. The first thing is to start to, when we're looking at the impact of the policies, and actually DC now has an office that does this, as some other jurisdictions do, when we're putting forward a policy proposal, to do a racial equity impact assessment, right? So to look at how would this policy impact individuals, families of different races and ethnicities. And so I gave, the example of the child tax credit. You could say, yeah, I just said it on its surface, it's going to help a whole bunch of people of different incomes, but it actually is disproportionately going to impact, in a positive way, families of color who have been left out. And I mentioned that before. When we could do an analysis of the previous policy, and if we did a racial equity analysis, we would see there were inequities. As many as 50% of Black and Latinx children were left out of that benefit under the previous policy because their families were in job situations where they earned too little. They had too little earnings to even qualify. And you had higher income people who, some would argue, maybe don't even need that benefit, who were getting access to that tax credit. And for low income people, that's a refundable tax credit. So it becomes like a child allowance. We do that same analysis of the current policy, which again, the policy is for 1 year. It captures whole bunch of those families who were previously left out. And I think we could, you know, take each of these policies and these proposals, and I think it's important to do the same kind of analysis. And that might be something, you know, for the city council in Alexandria, for, you know, for your members of Congress to encourage them to do, to say, okay, this is a good policy on its surface, but is it actually, if we say our goal is to, you know, some might say reduce racial disparities. I would say if our goal is to dismantle structural and systemic racism, then how are we going to assess this policy to know that it's doing that, right? Like you could say, wait, we've got this policy and it's going to help decrease unemployment in Alexandria. I go back to those statistics. Okay, great. We get to a place where overall unemployment, and I know there have been times like this where Alexandria is like 3%. But then we look at the data and we look at the unemployment rate for Black workers and Latinx workers, and we see, or women versus men, and we see very different statistics. And so maybe we need to analyze our policy proposals around jobs and economic development in the same way, and to see what the impact would be on people of different genders and different races.
Great, thank you. Okay, so one more question, maybe it's like a little combo. So can you give examples of cities that are successfully addressing mobility? Yes.
That's a big question. I could probably, like, mobility as a whole would be tough, but I could say, I could probably think of each of the areas I talked about. There are some different efforts, you know, in different communities. I also feel like the landscape has been shaken up a lot in the last year. So there are cities that, some of the data that I've presented, that have really used the data as kind of a, to rally their community on economic mobility. And so Charlotte is one that comes to mind. They looked at that data that I presented from Rosh Chetty, and there was a kind of this ranking of cities that was done to say, well, where did, and it was largely big cities, where do big cities rank? And on a list of 50, they were 50th. And they really said, wow, do we really want to be 50th in the nation for economic mobility? And so they formed a task force, came up with a bunch of their own local recommendations that they're starting to implement. So that one's probably one of the broadest I can think of, because they, just like our work, looked across a bunch of different issues. And then there are communities that have, you know, sort of picked a specific issue area. So there are some communities around the country that have looked at affordable housing, and that are part of a network that is implementing something called purpose-built communities, that's trying to create more mixed income, right, economically diverse communities. There are other communities that have taken education, kind of cradle to college education, and said that's the strategy that we want to implement. And there's a network of organizations using kind of this collective impact Strive model. It's called the Strive Together Network. So I could, there are for each sort of issue area, I can think of communities, but there are very few that have said economic mobility as a whole, you know, we're going to take all of it on.
Okay, that was incredible. Nisha, thank you so much for sharing with us. I feel like there's so much